Imagine a king so infamous, so despised, that his very name became a curse in the streets of his own country. A monarch remembered not for glory, not for prosperity, but for betrayal, repression, and scandal. To some, he was El Deseado, the desired one, the king who promised salvation after years of war. But to most, he became El Rey Felon, the criminal king. His reign was a storm of corruption, lust, and tyranny, and his life a grotesque theater where power and perversion shared the stage. This was Ferdinand VII of Spain, and tonight, we're going to uncover his story, a story of decadence and betrayal so dark that it still haunts the memory of Europe. But beware, the deeper we go, the stranger and more disturbing it becomes. Because Ferdinand's life wasn't just the story of one man. It was the tragedy of an entire nation. But before we dive into his scandals, before we expose the perversions whispered in palace corridors, we must first understand the world that created him. Because Ferdinand did not rise in a vacuum. He was born into a Spain already crumbling, a kingdom once mighty, now staggering under the weight of decline. At the dawn of the 19th century, Spain was no longer the empire that had ruled the seas. The days of conquistadors and golden galleons were long gone. Wars, corruption, and economic mismanagement had hollowed out the once proud monarchy. Its colonies in the Americas were restless, hungry for independence. At home, the economy faltered, agriculture stagnated, and famine haunted villages. Spain, once the terror of Europe, was now a weakened, fragile state. And at the very center of this decline stood the royal court of King Charles IV, Ferdinand's father. But Charles was no strong ruler. He was seen as weak, indecisive, and easily manipulated. Real power did not belong to the king. It belonged to his minister, Manuel Godoy, a man who rose from obscurity to become the most powerful figure in Spain. Godoy's rapid rise was fueled not only by political cunning, but by scandal. He was rumored to be the lover of Queen Maria Luisa, Ferdinand's mother. Imagine what that meant for young Ferdinand. He grew up in a palace where his father was ridiculed as a puppet, his mother was whispered about in shame, and the true ruler of Spain was a commoner elevated by lust and favoritism. In the corridors of the Escorial and Aranjuez, courtiers mocked his family, laughed at his father, and gossiped about his mother's supposed infidelities. For a boy destined to be king, this was not an education in dignity. It was an education in humiliation. And humiliation breeds resentment. Ferdinand learned early to despise Godoy, whom he saw as both a usurper and a personal enemy. But he also grew to resent his own parents, who seemed powerless, corrupt, and complicit. He grew up cold, suspicious, and hungry for power. He did not learn statesmanship, he learned intrigue. He did not learn leadership, he learned betrayal. Even as a prince, Ferdinand was plotting. He surrounded himself with factions at court who dreamed of removing Godoy, of casting down the hated minister and restoring the honor of the crown. But Ferdinand's idea of restoring honor was not noble reform. It was vengeance. It was ambition. He was determined to seize power, no matter the cost. And soon, the perfect storm arrived. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte turned his gaze towards Spain. The French emperor, master of Europe, saw in Spain both an opportunity and a weakness. He wanted control of the Iberian Peninsula, and Spain's royal family, weak, divided, and corrupt, gave him the opening he needed. Napoleon lured Charles IV, Ferdinand, and the Spanish court to the French town of Bayonne. There, under immense pressure, both Charles and Ferdinand were forced to abdicate the throne. Napoleon handed the crown of Spain to his brother Joseph Bonaparte. In one stroke, Spain was humiliated, its royal family broken, its throne stolen, its people betrayed. For Ferdinand, it was a disaster, and yet perhaps also a relief. He had schemed to overthrow Godoy, and now Godoy was gone. But instead of becoming king, Ferdinand became a prisoner. Napoleon sent him to France, where he was kept under watch. But don't imagine chains or dungeons. Ferdinand's imprisonment was one of luxury. In the chateau of Valenque, Ferdinand lived as a captive prince. He had fine clothes, lavish meals, servants, and comfort. While the Spanish people bled in the streets, fighting guerrilla wars against French soldiers, Ferdinand dined, drank, and lived in relative ease. His people called him a martyr, a victim of Napoleon's tyranny. But was he really? Or was he simply enjoying his captivity, waiting for the tide to turn? The irony was bitter. While peasants starved, while Spanish patriots were shot in Madrid, while entire villages burned in the War of Independence, their so-called king was strolling in French gardens, living as a pampered hostage. To his supporters, he was El Deseado, the desired one, a king in exile who would one day return. To his critics, he was already a traitor, a coward who preferred comfort to sacrifice. And yet, the day would come when Ferdinand returned. And when he did, the people would cheer his name, believing that salvation had finally arrived. But they had no idea the man they welcomed back was not a savior. He was about to become one of the most hated rulers in Spanish history. When Napoleon fell, the tide turned once again. And in 1814, after 6 years of absence, Ferdinand VII returned to Spain. His arrival was like the return of a long-lost savior. Crowds cheered in the streets, bells rang in cathedrals, and banners proclaimed him the desired one. To a nation exhausted by war, famine, and occupation, he seemed like the symbol of renewal. But appearances are dangerous, because the Ferdinand who returned was not a hero. He was something far darker. In the war against Napoleon, Spaniards had written a new constitution, the Constitution of Cádiz of 1812. It was a document of hope, a liberal charter promising freedom of the press, representation, and limits on royal power. For many, it was the dawn of a new Spain. But for Ferdinand, it was an insult. The Constitution meant sharing power. It meant restraint. And Ferdinand had no intention of being restrained. Within weeks of returning, Ferdinand tore the Constitution apart. He declared it void, abolished its reforms, and restored absolute monarchy. The same man who had been celebrated as a liberator now revealed himself as a tyrant. His first act of power was betrayal of the very people who had bled for his return. The repression began immediately. Liberals who had fought bravely against Napoleon were hunted down as traitors. Writers, journalists, and thinkers were silenced. Prisons filled with political opponents. Exiles began, executions followed. Ferdinand VII ruled with the iron fist of a man who feared his own people. The streets of Madrid, once filled with hope, now trembled under the weight of fear. But Ferdinand's cruelty did not stop at politics. His personal life was just as dark, just as scandalous, and it would become the source of the reputation that haunts him to this day. Ferdinand married 4 times. His first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, was said to be spirited, intelligent, and ambitious. But the marriage was bitter. They despised each other. She died young, in 1806, under suspicious circumstances. Rumors spread that Ferdinand himself had poisoned her, or at least rejoiced in her death. His second wife, Maria Isabel of Braganza, came from Portugal. She tried to bring some dignity to the court, even encouraging the arts and attempting to civilize her husband's behavior. But in 1818, while giving birth, she died suddenly. Once again, whispers filled the palace. Was it misfortune? Or was there a curse upon Ferdinand's wives? His third marriage was perhaps the most tragic. In 1819, Ferdinand married Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. She was just 16 years old, a shy girl thrown into a marriage with a man in his 30s, already infamous for cruelty. She lived in fear, overwhelmed by her husband's temper and behavior. Less than 10 years later, she too was dead, another young queen in the grave. Finally, in 1829, Ferdinand married Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily. Unlike his other wives, she survived him. From this union was born Isabella II, the daughter who would inherit his troubled crown. But even Maria Cristina suffered under his rule, forced to endure a husband already broken by disease, scandal, and corruption. 3 wives dead, 1 survivor, each death surrounded by suspicion, gossip, and tragedy. For Spaniards, it was no longer coincidence. Ferdinand's marriages seemed cursed, or perhaps poisoned by his own behavior. But what truly gave him his infamous reputation was not tragedy, but perversion. Ferdinand was obsessed with sex. The whispers of the court spoke of orgies in hidden chambers, of fetishes so strange that even his closest allies were horrified. He pursued women of all classes, noble ladies, courtesans, even common girls dragged into the palace. And unlike other kings, he did not hide it well. Foreign ambassadors wrote about it. Letters to London, Paris, and Vienna described the Spanish king's behavior in scandalous detail. Imagine, instead of reporting only on treaties and wars, diplomats were forced to describe Ferdinand's private debauchery. They called him vulgar, grotesque, and insatiable. At the same time, Ferdinand presented himself in public as the most Catholic, the most devout of kings. He filled processions with pomp, prayed ostentatiously, and used religion as a shield for his tyranny. To conservatives, he was the defender of tradition. But behind closed doors, he was the very opposite of Christian virtue. He was a hypocrite of the highest order, and his court became a circus of corruption. Favorites were rewarded with titles, mistresses were showered with gifts, and money from the treasury was funneled into Ferdinand's pleasures. All while Spain starved. Villages went hungry, revolts flared, colonies in the Americas broke free. But Ferdinand was too busy satisfying his appetites. For the people of Spain, this was unbearable. Their so-called king was not only a tyrant, but a pervert, a man who embodied the corruption of monarchy itself. And the whispers grew louder. El Desada was gone. Now he was El Rey Felon, the criminal king. But Ferdinand was not finished. His scandals would only grow, and his own body would betray him. Diseases, obesity, and decay would transform him into a living symbol of corruption. And then, his desperate struggle for an heir would plunge Spain into civil war. As Ferdinand aged, the mask of power began to slip. The man who had once strutted across Spain as a triumphant monarch now faced the slow collapse of his own body. Years of indulgence, gluttony, and excess had taken their toll. By the 1820s, Ferdinand was a broken figure, obese, crippled by gout, and so weakened that he could barely walk without assistance. Observers described him as grotesque, swollen, and sickly, yet still demanding the pomp and obedience of a king. He was a living contradiction, a body collapsing under decay, but while still clinging desperately to absolute power. For many Spaniards, his physical ruin was poetic justice. They whispered that God himself had punished the perverted king. Rumors circulated about venereal disease, the price of his endless lust. Whether true or not, the whispers spread like wildfire, reinforcing the image of a monarch consumed by his own vices. Even in his sickbed, Ferdinand demanded pleasures, summoning women to his chambers while his body failed him. The spectacle of a king half dead, yet still obsessed with sex, only deepened the disgust of his people. And yet, despite his failing health, Ferdinand remained obsessed with control. He tightened censorship, hunted liberals, and filled prisons. His paranoia grew. Ministers came and went, often discarded as soon as they questioned him. He trusted no one, not even his closest advisors. Spain was governed not by vision or reform, but by the whims of a decaying tyrant. But there was one matter Ferdinand could not escape: the question of succession. For years, his marriages had produced no sons. And in a monarchy, no failure is greater than leaving the throne without a male heir. Finally, with his fourth wife, Maria Cristina, a child was born, Isabella. She was his joy, his hope, his last chance at a dynasty. But there was a problem. Spanish law, the Salic law, forbade women from inheriting the throne. If Ferdinand died without a son, the crown would pass to his brother, Carlos. Carlos was a staunch absolutist, beloved by conservatives and reactionaries. Many in Spain already considered him the rightful heir, but Ferdinand would not accept it. He issued the pragmatic sanction: abolishing the Salic law and declaring that Isabella would inherit the throne. Overnight, the country was divided. Supporters of Isabella rallied behind the king and Maria Cristina. Supporters of Carlos, the Carlists, saw it as betrayal, a theft of their legitimate claim. This dispute did not end with Ferdinand's life. It exploded after his death into the bloody Carlist Wars, civil conflicts that ravaged Spain for decades. Ferdinand's obsession with control, his refusal to leave a stable succession, plunged the nation into chaos. Even in death, he continued to destroy his country. For the Spanish people, Ferdinand's reign was a nightmare. While other nations embraced reform, Spain stagnated. While Britain and France advanced industry and ideas, Spain lived under censorship and fear. The economy collapsed, famine spread, and revolts were crushed with brutal force. Spain's vast colonies in the Americas slipped away one by one. Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile. The empire built over centuries was lost in a single generation. And through it all, Ferdinand seemed to care only for himself. Taxes rose to pay for his court, his mistresses, his endless pleasures. Villages starved while the king feasted. Families mourned in silence as sons were exiled or executed for daring to speak of liberty. And in the streets of Madrid, Ferdinand's name was spat out with hatred. He was not just a tyrant. He was a curse. By the time he died in 1833, Ferdinand VII had become the symbol of everything rotten in the monarchy. His body, swollen and ruined, reflected the state of Spain itself, diseased, weakened, decayed. His death brought no peace, only war. As the Carlist conflict erupted, his legacy was not glory, but ruin. And yet, his story still fascinates, because Ferdinand VII was not only a political failure. He was a man whose private vices became inseparable from his public crimes. He showed how the corruption of the body and the corruption of power are one and the same. So, was Ferdinand VII truly the most perverted king in history? Or was he simply one of the most incompetent, cruel, and selfish rulers ever to sit on a throne? Perhaps he was both. His life was a grotesque play where lust, betrayal, and tyranny shared the stage, and Spain paid the price. One thing is certain: Ferdinand VII remains a warning from history, a reminder that when kings rule only for themselves, when power is consumed by desire, an entire nation can be destroyed. But now, the question is yours. What do you think? Was Ferdinand VII the most perverted king in history, or just the worst Spain